Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, my name is Ophir Gutelzon, co-founder and leader in Unacceptable, based in Palo Alto, near San Francisco. Today, we are after a horrible weekend and devastating 11 months almost since October 7th. With 101 hostages still in captivity. And we are also, after a devastating weekend where we got 6 hostages that was murdered by Hamas, and hundreds of thousands of people took the street in Israel demanding a ceasefire and deal now and stop sabotaging the deal. And we're going to talk about that. So I hope you are all good. We had a couple of events this weekend, and I'm sure you all had some vigils in your own cities. So today we are joined to talk about the judicial overhaul that we were all being informed of until October 7th. We're joined by Yaniv, Professor Yaniv Roznai, which is an expert in constitutional law, an associate professor and vice dean at Harry Redsner Law School, and co-director of the Rubinstein Center of Constitutional Constitutional Challenges in the Reichman University, and a member of the Israeli Law Professors Forum for Democracy. Yaniv, thank you for taking the time in the evening in Israel and joining us.
Thank you for the invitation, Ophir. Thanks.
Yeah, it sounds like an unrelated topic to whatever is going on right now in Israel, the war, the Gaza war, the hostages, the evacuees in the country. Obviously, the experience that we are having here with the rise of anti-Semitism, it all seems like every day looks like a whole year, and somehow we're ending up talking about the judicial overhaul. Or the judicial coup, as Professor Kahneman, late Professor Kahneman, said very straightforward a year ago in the UN. Give us, in your point of view, how it's all connected. Why we're sitting here, why we're talking about the judicial coup, how it's connected, and again, assume that many here knew about the judicial overhaul before, but they don't necessarily know everything about the parliamentary system in Israel, but they all care and love Israel and want to keep it Jewish and democratic.
So thanks again, Ophir, for the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining for this event. So let me very briefly maybe try to explain why the judicial overhaul is important, why we're discussing it, and how it is all relevant to the war and to the democratic future of Israel. So the idea is that, if you all recall, last year in January, the Minister of Justice proposed a package of so-called constitutional reforms, which we termed the judicial overhaul. I won't delve into each of these reforms, but the basic idea was to limit judicial review power of the court, to strip down courts' authority of administrative review, to change the way judges are selected so that the coalition would be able to dominate and control this process of appointing judges to all courts, to all tribunals, ranking not just to the Supreme Court, even to the lower courts, and in a way to lower the status of legal advisors to the government. This is very briefly in a nutshell. And the fear was that this package of reform would provide the government with lots of powers, because anyway, in our system, unlike the US, we are missing rigid mechanisms of checks and balances that exist in other places. So we have a parliamentary system in which the government basically controls the legislator without any political checks on the government power. So we don't have a rigid constitution, we don't have a rigid Bill of Rights, we don't have two houses of parliament. We don't have a president that can veto these kind of decisions, etc. So anyway, the government is very, very strong. And the fear was that if this so-called reform would be enacted, this would provide a government with absolute powers without any restrictions. And if you all recall, if you remember the amazing, the really outstanding civil protest movement against the reform, the Israeli citizens have managed to block these formal attempts, or at least most of them. And let me take you just on the time frame. In July, the Knesset was able to enact one piece of legislation that was important, carteling courts authority to strike down decisions of the government or of the prime minister if they are unreasonable. And this law was invalidated by the court in January, that said that it harms the Israeli character as a democratic state, and therefore it is unconstitutional, striking it down. This was January, already after October 7th, during the war. And it seemed to many of us that the judicial overhaul is behind us, that we're done, that now we're focusing on the war. I want to remind you that one of our ministers, the Minister of Education, Kish, a few days after October 7, he said, look, we're responsible. We, the government, we've been dealing with nonsense. We've been dealing with the court instead of dealing with the important things such as the security. But it seems like, so in the few days after October 7, it seemed like the government has learned its lesson. And it's not going to focus on the judicial system anymore. The reason we are meeting today is this was wrong. We were wrong in our, in a way, maybe aspiration that the government has changed its track. But no, what we see nowadays, actually, in the last few months, is that those politicians who wanted to act without any limitations, without any restrictions, who wanted to strip down gatekeepers and courts' powers, are still trying to do that. This is still their aim. Only this time, they're trying to do it through other means, not formal constitutional changes, but through multiple sub-constitutional means. And I mean by that ordinary laws, administrative regulations, trying to capture gatekeepers, and later on maybe we'll give you examples for that. And the government now has gone back to the exact same track it was on October 6th. So this is one reason why we're gathering here today, because the government is now continuing its efforts to undermine the rule of law in Israel. The second important point is the connection to the war, because the ideas I've mentioned earlier behind the judicial overhaul was what we call executive aggrandizement, to make the government extremely powerful, to allow the executive to act without any restrictions. And what we see now, that the war actually allows or provides the opportunity for Prime Minister Netanyahu to really act as if he's almost a sole leader of the country, as if he's a monarch or a president. And I remind you, we are not a presidential system. We're a parliamentary system in which the government is the main executive, and it is also bound or responsible to the parliament, to the legislature, to the Knesset. But we've seen various instances in which Benjamin Netanyahu makes all the decisions alone without any checks on his powers. And let me just maybe give you one example, which is to me perhaps one of the most crucial ones. According to our constitution, to our basic law of the government, if you want to initiate a war or to start some kind of an aggression, an armed attack that would amount to an aggression, or an armed attack that would likely bring into a war, you need to bring it to the cabinet. you need to bring it to that governmental office that is responsible to that. The prime minister alone cannot make this decision, obviously. And just 2 months ago, in July, if you remember, there was an assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, one of the prominent Hamas leaders in Iran. There are according to various media publications, it is probable that Israel was behind it. This is not officially, of course, and Israel has not taken any responsibility for that. But this is the assumption. Now, to make such a decision that will likely bring into a regional war, you need to bring this decision to the cabinet. But this decision was never brought to the cabinet. And it seems prima facie, again, this is my own interpretation of events, nothing formally written, that this decision was made by the prime minister and the minister of defense alone. And it is not a case that is not by incident that the attorney general, in a letter she sent a few days ago to the prime minister and to the ministers in the government, she said that she is extremely worried. This was an alarming letter. She said that she is extremely worried about decision-making processes in the government, and that the government ignores important constitutional rules and due process. And she says that she mentions that this occurs even in extremely important and delicate matters of security. Now, she's hinting to that event in July. She's not saying that explicitly, but one can understand or infer that this is what she's referring to. And this is extremely worrying. If in such an issue that is probably the most important issue in our national security, Netanyahu makes these decisions on his own, then this is extremely problematic. But this is just one example, and there are many more. Ophir, you're still muted.
Anyway, I think it's worth just I mean, as part of the judicial overhaul, I mean, the one of the things that the government was trying to remove was the idea that they need to obey to what the general attorney is actually the general attorney is actually the one that take the decision, is it legal or not legal, until you take it to court, right? Something is legal or not legal. I mean, she's reframing the law for the government. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about her job, her responsibility, and then it will connect to what you said probably about her letter.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. This is a very good point. So in Israel, we have an extremely strong attorney general. The attorney general is not a politician. It is a professional jurist, a legal person, and it is probably the second most important legal figure in the country after the Supreme Court. And according to our court's jurisprudence, the attorney general has a binding force. His legal opinions has binding force upon the government. In other words, he is the official interpreter of the law vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis the executive. So whatever the attorney general says the law is, this means that this is the law and the government has to abide by it. And if it doesn't abide by it, then probably the attorney general will refuse to represent the government in legal proceedings. Probably. And this has been the case in the last few decades. As part of the judicial overhaul that I've mentioned, what the Ministry of Justice proposed, he has proposed first to change the way the legal advisors to the government are appointed. So instead of being independent professionals, the idea was that they will be political appointees of the minister, so that each minister can bring his or her own lawyer in a way. And secondly, to decrease the status of their legal advice from binding to non-binding. So it would only be an advice that they will be able to freely ignore. Now, you need to understand, I think, that in comparative terms, such status of the Attorney General is quite unique. Is extremely powerful person in comparative perspective. I think it's required in light of our other extremely weak mechanisms of checks and balances, but this is the situation. Now, Yariv Levin, the Minister of Justice, failed in his attempts to change by law the formal status of legal advice of the Attorney General and the lawyers of the government. But what they failed to do formally, they're actually trying to do now de facto. This is what they're actually doing nowadays. We had various instances, multiple, in which the government, the cabinet, and various ministers simply ignore the Attorney General's legal opinion, legal advice. And when this happens, they tell the legal advisor or the Attorney General, take it to court. We don't care. We don't want to listen to you. We want to take our own private lawyers, and we don't want to listen to your advice. We've seen various cases of that, and this can also explain the previous example I gave regarding the assassination. And this is one of the most.
And it's not just the yeah, and it's not just the ministers. I mean, we're talking about the prime minister as well, that is kind of like avoiding that and right.
Exactly, it's the prime minister and the various ministers and the cabinet. And you need to understand that in this area in which the government makes a decision which goes against the Attorney General, but before we have a judgment by the Supreme Court, this is the twilight zone in which the gray area in which the government wants to act, because in this area, they can act and do whatever they want without any restrictions, without any limitations. This is chaos. This is not a rule of law or rule by law situation because they are knowingly ignoring the Attorney General. And this is extremely troubling because it shows us that whatever they try to do formally and fail to do, now they're simply doing with, let's say, facts on the ground in various administrative or regulatory means. And in this area, in this gray zone that I mentioned, this twilight zone, all the burden of preserving law rests on the gatekeepers, on the bureaucracy. Let me just give you maybe one example that is interesting. So we had a recent judgment by the Supreme Court concerning ultra-Orthodox who do not serve in the military. And the Supreme Court said that the IDF, the military, must start recruiting these people to military service. But furthermore, that the government cannot subsidize, cannot give money to those ultra-Orthodox who do not serve in the military. And this is, of course, a monetary, extremely difficult situation for the ultra-Orthodox institutions. Now, of course, the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, he wants to continue and pass the money because he wants to preserve the coalition. And the Attorney General said, no, as of November 1st, you have to cut the financing and you cannot provide any more money to these institutions. But now Smotrich is trying to find any possible way to bypass this decision and give the money, notwithstanding that legal advice. This is just one example, but we have multiple examples for this.
And we can probably talk about more, I mean, a couple of more. I mean, one of the biggest one is, I mean, there is, we need to remember that Netanyahu is, in order to keep his government intact, and again, going back to the hostage solution situation and the ceasefire, he's relying on Ben Gvir and Smotrich as his allies, which are extreme right, messianic, and in the case of Smotrich and in the case of Ben Gvir, they are basically the people that come from the Rabbi Kahana sector. I mean, now Netanyahu has put them in position. So you just spoke about Smotrich as taking one of the decision, and the other big decision that was taken is like we're talking about is the police that is turning to be the police, like a militia of the Ben Gvir. Again, speaking about chaos and speaking about what we see in the violence, police violence on the streets. Another decision that was rejected by Ben Gvir is related to that is probably one of the first signs of constitutional crisis, right? That we are looking at. So, two questions. One is what's the situation with Ben Gvir, and are we actually in a constitutional crisis? And if that's the case, what should we do about that, or what the government can do about that?
Yeah, so I think the police and Ben Gvir is a very important issue that we need to emphasize. Just those of you who are unfamiliar, our Minister of Interior Security, he's actually a convicted criminal, and speaking about unreasonable appointments, I cannot think of any more far-fetched or unreasonable appointment than that. But this is the case. He is the minister. And the head of the internal security services of the Shin Bet recently said, I think it was 3 weeks ago, he said, if you're unaware, he said it in a cabinet meeting, the Israeli police has fallen, meaning that it is no longer independent, but it is now only following the minister. It is entirely political. It is a political government entirely following the minister of internal security. And one example that Ophir was alluding to, there was a police officer that threw a hand grenade into a protest, one of the many protests that we had against the government. And there is now an investigation, an internal police investigation on that matter against that police officer. And according to our rules, as long as there is such an investigation, that officer cannot be promoted. And what happened is that in a recent ceremony, the minister Ben Gvir and the new chief of the police, who was just appointed by Ben Gvir, completely ignored that rule and completely ignored the advice by the attorney general that this person cannot be promoted, and promoted that person. So we are now in a situation in which every minister, the extreme minister that controls the government and the coalition, can do whatever he wants. And I think one of the most important things that we need to emphasize is that the prime minister here is in a conflict of interest. He's in a very big problem because on the one hand, he does not want to end the war, because the second he ends the war, he understands that two things need to happen. One, the country must go for elections. It's unthinkable that this government will continue even for a single day after the war. To my personal opinion, this government cannot even continue even as another second as we speak. But at the very least, once this war is over, so here is in a conflict of interest. And secondly, a second after the war ends, there would have to be some kind of a commission of inquiry about the events of October 7 and the events that followed. And Netanyahu doesn't want any of these two options. So basically, for Netanyahu, there is no incentive to end the war, vice versa. He has all the incentives to continue the war as long as possible. And we see in surveys that he's becoming stronger and stronger. So he's now playing on time in a way. And I need to remind you all that as we speak, there is a criminal trial against Netanyahu on allegations of corruption, fraud, and breach of trust in the District Court of Jerusalem. And he's supposed to begin to give his testimony around December, I think, or end of November or December. So he's in a.
So that's all connected to. Yeah, so that's all connected to why the government is still running and what's the limitation. one of the biggest questions that during the judicial overhaul was about the Supreme Court and control of the Supreme Court. So we are going to the third point that we wanted to discuss today, which is the Minister Levine avoiding convening the committee for selection, judge selection. And on top of that, we can talk about that, and again, avoiding maybe a decision of the Supreme Court that will ask him to actually convene. So let's talk about that, and then I'll start to take questions from the chat.
Great. So yeah, so it's not only that the judicial overhaul is back in all force, but also that in the middle of the war, we are now, it seems like we are heading towards a major constitutional crisis. And let me explain why. So in January 4th last year, Yaniv Levin tried to change the composition of the Judicial Selection Committee, as I've mentioned earlier, so that the coalition will be able to control it and appoint all the judges it wants to the Supreme Court and to the lower courts. This failed. The bill for changing the composition of that committee is still pending at the plenary of the Knesset for second and third reading. So that's one day, one evening. They can bring it anytime. This is still pending since February last year. He failed to do that, but because he failed to change the composition for many months, the Minister of Justice, refused to appoint judges with the current committee, and he simply refused to convene that committee until petitions were submitted to the High Court of Justice. Once these petitions were submitted, he suddenly began to convene the committee and to appoint judges to lower courts. However, our Supreme Court, we have 15 judges. We have 2 missing Supreme Court judges since October, when the former president of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, Esther Chayut, retired, together with another justice, Anat Baron. Both of them retired in October. And since then, Yaniv Levin refused to appoint judges to the Supreme Court or to appoint a president, because he wanted to bring his own people. And maybe I should say a word about the president. According to the Israeli Constitutional Convention or practice, the most senior judge at the Supreme Court becomes the president automatically. We call that the seniority.
Senior by age.
No, not by age. No, well, senior by the time he's spent at the court.
Okay.
And then this rule basically says that, well, because you need to remember, unlike the US, our judges retire at 70. Maybe it's important to emphasize. Okay, so there's a strict deadline. So once once the president arrives to the age of 70, he or she retires, and then the next most senior judge is appointed as the president. And this system has some advantages, some disadvantages. The biggest advantages are that it keeps the independence of the Chief Justice. They are not subject to any pressure of the politicians or of the Bar Association. They don't need to make sure that their decisions are of the liking of anyone. So it is a very important rule in Israel, and it has been obeyed and followed for 75 years. But Yaniv Levin doesn't want it. He wants to appoint his own Chief Justice, his own president of the court, who is not the most senior, and is trying in a way to hold that position as a hostage in the negotiation with now the person who is filling that position as the Chief Justice, Fogelman. So what we've seen in the last few months is that Yaniv Levin is refusing to fill that position, and is insisting on bringing his own person as a president of the court, and also 2 people that he wants to bring as judges to the Supreme Court. The other members of the committee, he doesn't have the majority that is required, because you need to get 7 out of 9 in order to appoint a justice to the Supreme Court. So he doesn't have the majority, and because of that, he refuses to convene the committee. In order to appoint a president, the Chief Justice, you need an ordinary majority of the committee, so 5 versus 4. And our Minister of Justice is in a minority. So he doesn't want to convene the committee because he knows that once he convenes the committee, the most senior judge will be appointed. And he doesn't want it.
And it's important to add 2 more points, and correct me if I'm wrong, Yaniv. One is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the one that will nominate the ועדת החקירה הממלכתית, the committee.
Yeah, the Commission of Inquiry.
The Commission of Inquiry for the October 7th war. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that by not convening the committee, again, Yaniv, Minister Levin is basically putting a bottleneck on the whole judiciary in Israel, because there is so many missing judges, right? So that's holding back on everyone's case. So again, speaking about party over country during a war, or country over party, that's another point. And the last thing I want to mention is that in all the last judgments of the Supreme Court, even the most conservative judges was agreeing almost unanimously about the Orthodox drafting and others. So it's not just Levin. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's not just that Levin is trying to appoint a conservative Chief of Justice. He wants to make it someone that is a yes man for Netanyahu and Levin point of view.
Exactly. This is my own interpretation as well. I don't think that Yariv Levin is really looking into conservative judges. We have many very qualified conservative judges who can be appointed, but for some reason he doesn't want them. He wants either the most extreme ones or simply yes men that he can trust. And indeed, it is very crucial that the president of the Supreme Court is the one that will appoint the composition of the Commission of Inquiry. So this is crucial because obviously the government doesn't want the commission to be extremely independent and powerful. They don't want it. They want to control it. They want to capture it. So this is a really important point. Thank you, Phil, for mentioning that. So what we've seen in the last few weeks, the court, and remember, we are missing this position of Chief Justice since October last year. Okay, almost a year. And the court refrained from intervening because the court said, look, the Minister of Justice, he is responsible for convening the committee. He has discretion to do that. We do not want to interfere in his discretion. But there is a certain point in time in which not convening the committee is unreasonable. So last week, the Supreme Court said, look, after giving him more and more time to reach certain agreements with the current Chief Justice in office, who's filling that position, he told Minister Levin, you have to convene the committee. If you don't do that soon, we will give a formal judgment, forcing you in a way to do that. And automatically, the second that happened, high officials in the coalition told Minister Levin, you should simply ignore it. If there is such a judgment that would undermine your authority, you should simply ignore that judgment. And it seems like that we are now heading towards a clash, some kind of a constitutional crisis by which the High Court of Justice would give an order to the Minister of Justice to convene the committee. He will probably ignore it, and then who knows what will happen. And even if he will not ignore it and will convene it, and Yitzhak Amit, the most senior judge who's supposed to be appointed as a president, he will probably simply have no contact with him, no collaboration, no professional collaboration, and this would be a complete undermining of the entire judicial system. You cannot work like that.
What does the constitutional crisis means? Like, and I don't know if you can. There is a question from the audience, like, who can enforce a decision in the case of a constitutional crisis? Is it like the Shin Bet? Who is protecting? How can the democracy protect itself?
So that's a crucial question because it also relates to some of the things we've mentioned earlier. I mean, imagine a situation by which you have the court saying A, and a minister or some kind of an administrative agent refusing and saying B, then who do you listen to depends very much on the bureaucracy and on the gatekeepers. So, but who are the ones who are supposed to enforce these kind of judgments? I mean, the High Court of Justice doesn't have a military, right? So who's supposed to enforce these judgments? It is the police. And the police is controlled by Ben-Gvir. That's the big problem. That we're not even sure that there is an independent body that would enforce this decision. If you would ask me, so if the court gives certain order and Ben-Gvir gives an alternative order, to whom would the police abide by? I don't know.
I would want to dive deep a little bit for that, just again under the assumption that not everyone knows everything. Under the rule of law in Israel, the police is not obeyed to the Minister of Interior; it's obeyed to the Chief of the Police. What happens since, and correct me if I'm wrong, Yaniv, and what happened over the last since January last year when Ben-Gvir took the police. I mean, most of the chiefs of the police kind of like become like a yes men because what the chief of police, what the chief Ben-Gvir is in charge of is their promotion. Right, so the concept of like Ben-Gvir taking over the police is not by law; it's just by influence. And Yaniv, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe elaborate on that.
Exactly. What we've seen, so it's exactly what we've seen now. That we have, it's Ben-Gvir, but it's not only Ben-Gvir. It's also Kari, the Minister of Communication, and other ministers. What they're trying to do now is to capture state institution by political appointments. So you appoint your own yes man, and then this person is loyal to you. This is what we've seen in Hungary and Poland and other places. Yeah, this is what we call Caesarian politics. And this is what we see now, I think, in Israel. And this is why it is so alarming in many instances. We want an independent police and not a political police. Just imagine, imagine the scenario. Let's assume we go for elections. This could be either 2026 when they are due or before that. And imagine that Ben-Gvir sends armed police officers to Arab neighborhoods to where the ballots are. And imagine some people being afraid to go to these ballots to vote. Just imagine the implications that our democracy could have simply by controlling the police. Okay, so it's not merely the question of controlling a protest, yes or no, or to, how aggressive are the police doing these protests, but there are major implications to this issue, and I think this is something that we need to be very worried about.
Yeah, and that's again buying time and getting power. And you referred to the Shin Bet statement about the police has fallen, and it's important to also mention again. I mean, like one of the examples where the police has fallen is obviously in the West Bank and other places where the police are supposed to take care of things. So again, police are now on the streets with a lot of aggression against protesters for releasing the hostages, and on the same time they were not arresting anyone in the interference to the in the break into the military base or the military court, or when people burned Kfar Jita village. So there is a lot of examples where the police is kind of like not acting, and that's really, really scary. And you talked about potential for Arabs polls not being enforced, but I mean, like it could be the same, like sending someone to Tel Aviv and intimidate. So voting intimidation is something we are familiar here in America as well, and it's really crucial to know that.
But Ophir, I did mention specifically the Arab cities because we have very small Arab parties, and it's enough that you get a few thousands that would not come to vote, and they will not pass the threshold to be elected, and then you can simply, this could be decisive for the elections. But I want to say something positive, at least, if you would allow me, because we don't want to,
Of
this was
course.
all extremely negative for the last 40 minutes. And I want to do say something positive. If you'd open television, what you see outside is quite astonishing. Even during war, you have every Saturday night thousands of people and tens of thousands of people uh, coming to protest against the government during war. This is not something that we need to take, very light. Usually during war, there is rally around the flag and people are afraid to go against the government. But we've seen that in Israel, and what we've seen uh, in the last 3 days was quite astonishing. We've had, I think, about 700,000 Israelis going out to protest and calling for the release of the hostages and calling Netanyahu to make a deal, which is quite astonishing. Think about the number wise, just compare it to the US, right? So I think there is a positive element here. I hope that civil society is awakening in a way, and this perhaps would make some kind of a political shift. I'm not that optimistic, but at least it's better than nothing.
And you kept saying, and I shared your speech at the Democracy Square from last Saturday, I think. And you keep saying, I mean, with people asking like, what can we do? I mean, like, and what can be done? And I think that yours keep saying that the most important gatekeeper right now is the Israelis on the streets who would give tailwind to the gatekeeper, to the general attorney and others. I mean, is that? I mean, and I want to say before. I mean, you talked about reasonable, and just as a reminder, again, the reasonableness clause that the courts will decide, the Supreme Court will decide upon now was actually not passed by because of the gatekeepers on the streets. And that's astonishing, and I agree with you. That's very, very powerful and very, very positive. The what's happening in the international community? I mean, like, so when the judicial overhaul was actually happening, we heard a lot, professors, economists, people kind of like raising their voices and trying to explain, talk reason to the government. Do we hear these voices now raising again, or now because of the war, it's kind of like, again, under the radar, undercover, no one really noticing it that?
It's even worse because I think that now during the war, these kind of voices are even counterproductive in a way, because the Israeli people, they say, this is our security. And now you, from the outside, the international community, you're calling, either a ceasefire, or who are you to tell us that this is our security? Okay, so it's very different from what we've seen last year when the government said, oh, we just want to be like the US, this is why we're making these reforms. And then you have Americans saying, wait, this is not what's going on in the US, don't try to fool us. And so it's something completely different. So I think international sometimes in these instances, international voices can be counterproductive. But I need also to remind you the following. One, I think that some people in the Israeli government are trying to see what will be in the US elections. And maybe they are building or hoping that Trump will win, and then Trump will give the government more leeway to do whatever they want. I'm not even sure that's the case because it's such a wild card. But this is, I think, what they're hoping. And the second thing that we need to remember is that Israel nowadays is in two international tribunals, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, both of them in The Hague, one for allegations of genocide, which is complete nonsense that South Africa brought. But still it forces Israel to be in a very complicated situation. And the ICC, we are waiting for a possible arrest warrant in the ICC to Netanyahu and Gallant, the Minister of Defense. And I think every day we should hear from the ICC, which is extremely troubling. This would be the first time that we have a democratic leader being indicted or having a arrest warrant issued against him since the establishment of the ICC. The US is not a member to that court. So
And I added a link on the chat to a conversation we had, I think, in April about the ICJ and ICC. If anyone wants to get deeper into that.
there is
Um,
additional pressure on Israel.
and it's additional pressure that again, I mean, like people will say that, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we always said we need a very strong independent judiciary, is to actually go and investigate on our own, so we don't have the international courts to work on that. And that's, again, I mean, going back to incidents that happening right now in Israel, that we are, again, the government is trying to avoid investigating, like, and we didn't talk about the chief justice, the general attorney of the military, who actually the government is actually going against, I mean, or member of the government going against. I mean, that's something that's worth elaborating. It's another example.
Yeah, this is simply unbelievable. Of course, the IDF is obeying as much as possible IHL, international humanitarian law, and trying to abide by international obligations, etc. And for that, the Attorney General of the military is observing and supervising all the military operation. And what we've seen in the last few weeks, it's simply unbelievable. We've seen members of the coalition attacking that gatekeeper, attacking that attorney general, attorney general of the military, calling her, enemy of the state and a traitor, etc. It's simply having protests in front of her home because she wants to make sure that Israel observes the laws of war and the laws of armed conflicts. So this is simply unbelievable. And I'll just maybe say a word so people can understand what you've hinted to. In international law, in international criminal law, there's a basic principle called principle of complementarity. According to this principle, the ICC or even other national tribunals in the Netherlands or Spain or whatever, they can only exercise international jurisdiction or universal jurisdiction only if the domestic jurisdiction is unwilling or unable to investigate these kind of crimes. So the more our legal system shows that it is independent, that it is investigating things, then there is less probability that we will be in trouble at the ICC or in other countries. But vice versa, if there are no investigations, then we have no claim. This was one of our arguments, that we need a very strong and independent legal system. But with our government, they seem to, they're attacking our own institutions that are supposed to preserve the rule of law, which is mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, and it's again, I mean, it's part of breaking up the democracy, right? I mean, that is kind of like we need to remember that this government end goal is to turn Israel to a messianic theocracy. I mean, it started to judicial overhaul in other ways, but I mean, the essence of the two parties that is kind of like forcing Netanyahu to do whatever he does, I mean, to government, is ending up to turn Israel as much as they can to messianic theocracy. There is one thing that we didn't really talk about. I mean, the judicial overhaul is one way to turn us to a theocracy or to dictatorship or whatever it is. But there is also the general, the people that are actually in position, the Commissioner of Civil Service, right? I mean, the Commissioner of Civil Service is where is the gatekeeper that decide who will be in charge of different civil service positions. And that's another point where, again, the government is supposed to go by the law. There is a commissioner. They want to have a yes man there. That's another place to go through and fulfill the judicial overhaul.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, what the government is trying to do is basically to capture state institutions, right? To have yes men in various bureaucratic positions. And in order to do that, what they're trying to do now is to capture the position of the commissioner of the civil service, who is retiring this month in September. And in 2018, a few years ago, the government, the cabinet, adopted a resolution according to which the next time that this position will be filled, there will be an independent commission to appoint that person because of the importance of this position as a really important gatekeeper of all of all the civil service in the state. And in a recent meeting of the cabinet, uh, basically the government said, well, yeah, we remember that we made that decision in 2018, but now we no longer want it, and we appoint Netanyahu that he can appoint whoever he wants to that position. And Netanyahu will obviously bring a very weak person that will be loyal to him. And this, in a way, would allow the government to capture other bureaucratic positions much more easily. So this would be extremely dramatic for state capture. And here again, the Attorney General said that there is a legal prevention, that there's a legal difficulty here in that decision, but they did not listen to what she said, and now this is in proceedings before the High Court of Justice. So we see what happens.
So the biggest, I think that there, I see a repetitive question in the chat is like, so how come the government is getting stronger, or how come it's getting more support? And one, I would just comment on that, and then Yaniv, you can add on that. I mean, like, it's the polls are keep looking that most of the people of Israel is not supporting the government. They want an election. However, as time passed by and Netanyahu's amazing rhetoric continues, right? I mean, the effect of time is making people forget. So, but it is important to say that, again, people are taking the streets. Unfortunately, it took 6 hostages being killed, murdered by Hamas to actually get this inflection point. But Yaniv, I mean, like, what do you see from on the ground? Like, why do you think that why do you think that the impression is that Netanyahu is getting stronger from the
Well,
outside?
I'm not a professor of sociology and not and neither of psychology. So it's hard for me to say why this is happening. But if I'm trying to analyze it from my own perspective as a citizen, I think what we can see is the following thing. First, we need to remember that uh, Netanyahu and his government basically control very important media outlets, Channel 14, the new channel of I-24, etc. And you have uh, large segments of the society watching these media outlets, networks, and they simply see a parallel world, something completely different. If you open these TV channels, what you see is that Israel is winning, everything is great, everything is bright, and and that's a problem because these people do not see anything else. So obviously, when you're a captive audience in these channels and you don't see anything else, that's a main problem when it comes to public opinion. That's one thing. The second, I think that because people the most important thing for people now is security because of the sense of lack of security of October 7. So the entire society moved more to the right. No one wants to hear about Palestinian state. No one wants to hear of getting out of Gaza because the sense of security or insecurity is the most important element. And in this case, people are asking themselves, they're saying, many of the people that you speak to, they say the following, say, look, Netanyahu is awful. We don't like him. We hate him. We don't trust him. We don't believe what he says. But he's better than the other alternatives because the others are weaker than him. So that's a very rational analysis to many of the people. So I think this
Even though under his shift there was the largest massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust.
yeah, because Netanyahu is a genius in pointing the responsibility to all the others, to the
Deflecting it.
military, to the security services, to Yitzhak Rabin, to Sharon and the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Everyone are responsible. The Attorney General of the military, who's binding and tying the hands of the IDF soldiers. Everyone are responsible, apart from him.
Yeah.
And that's
Again,
marketing.
and that's just, again, I mean, just a general analysis of what you and I see. I mean, like, obviously we're not expert on that. Just reflecting what we see. I mean, I mean, we are almost at the end of the hour, and the question always comes up of like, what can we do from here? I would start, and then you can finalize with the last word. I mean, like, first of all, just by being here, you are doing a lot because you're ambassadors to your communities. Again, you love Israel, you're pro-Israeli, in this sense. I mean, like, you are doing the best you can. I mean, like, we are honestly in a position where the U.S. government is doing whatever they can to return back the hostages, to negotiate ceasefire. I see no pressure as much as I want to see more pressure on them. I don't see what it would help because they're so on top of it. There was a recommendation by someone to write to more MKs in Israel. Now you have WhatsApp. We can send you all the WhatsApp. You can write them that this is important to diaspora. That's an option. I can share the links to the WhatsApp of all the members of the Knesset. Anything else, Yaniv, that you can see what we can do from here? I mean, like, how can we support, or how can we get to support the democracy?
That's a great question. I think, of course, I think I'm trying to be very delicate here in what I'm saying. Obviously, U.S. Pressure in the right direction is of course a good thing, a positive thing. Being our democratic allies, I think keeping all the time the awareness to the hostages, not forgetting them, raising this issue everywhere and all the time is now the most crucial thing, because the hostages, the 101 hostages that are left, they don't have much time. And we cannot act as if nothing is happening. We cannot continue with our regular lives as long as they are there. So any opportunity that you or your friends and family have to raise your voice, to remember them, and this could help. This could help, and yeah, and of course pray
Yeah,
for
and
us.
I would add on that again. I mean, like, everyone is doing a lot to what we call bring them home rallies and bring them home awareness, and we're now adding a new word to the bring them home alive. And again, I mean, the pressure is, I mean, should be no doubt. I mean, Hamas is a horrible terrorist organization, and they are to blame for keeping those hostages there. What we know and we are seeing, and we hear President Biden and everyone else, is we have to put pressure on the government as well to get to a ceasefire, and it's on us to do both. And yeah, I would end by saying thank you, Yaniv. I mean, I know for many of us here, it's so complicated to grasp all the truths together. We are at war. We need to win the war, and the way we see it, and I think most of Israelis seeing it right now, winning the war will be when the hostages will be back home. And judicial overhaul and coup can strive as long as when under war, and as long as the war is keep going. And that's scary because at the end, when the war ends, we want to make sure it's Israel state, Jewish and democratic state. Thank you, Yaniv. Thank you, everyone, for joining. A reminder, on Friday, we are meeting with Amy Spitalnik, the CEO of, talking about how liberal Zionists are dealing with the anti-Semitism here. So join us. I'll share the information and the recording from today. And thank you, Yaniv, again. And thank you, everyone. Have a good night in Israel and the rest of the day here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.